Because in those days, you had to surrender your passport at the hotel. They had my bags, they had my passport, and there was, I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know where I was actually going. I did not know the name of the hotel, and I didn't know where it was, and I started to absolute panic. I thought, I'm in this sea of people. I don't know where to go. I was standing there. My heart's starting to beat like this. I thought, could I live here? Because that might happen. And I thought, yeah, India's a nice place. I could live here. It would take a while to carve out a life, but I could do it. And I miss my family.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
All right, let's jump right into this. I'm carrying on in a series I began a few weeks ago called Oh My God. Some of you were offended by that name right off the hop. But we've been restoring and reclaiming these great expressions that are meant to worship and praise our God. So week one, we talked about, oh, the heavens and the immensity of God's creation, 13.67 billion light years from one side to the other, beyond what any of us can possibly comprehend. Week two was, oh man, and we talked about the creation of man and the wondrous, incredible science and things that behind that. And my message today is entitled, Oh Good Lord. And we all know that expression. People use it today quite readily, and it's an expression of surprise, usually in a disappointed way, you probably noticed. We're going to be talking, obviously, we're talking about the greatness of God, but I want to talk also about the goodness of God. And what we're going to discover today is that God's goodness actually flows out of his greatness. And there's this theological word that we use and that the theologians talk about a lot, and it's the word sovereignty. And sovereignty is an important word. We understand sovereign nations, and we understand sovereign kings, and it means that there's nobody above them. They are sovereign. But when you talk about God's sovereignty, you're talking about something much more extensive than that. We're talking about how the fact that he is all-powerful and has all authority, and he controls everything, and the scripture says that his throne is in the heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. But the reason I want to talk about God's sovereignty is to prove to you and show to you that God's goodness flows out of his sovereignty. God's goodness flows out of his greatness. And when we get a revelation or an epiphany of how great he is, then you'll really begin to appreciate how good he is. And so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at Psalm 139, also written by David. And David writes this psalm, which is considered by most scholars as the greatest of all the psalms, and many scholars believe that it is the greatest passage in all of Scripture. You know how exciting this is? Even if this message falls completely flat, at least you had the greatest passage in the Bible to talk about, right? So I can't really lose here. That's the way I look at it. And so when we look at this, we discover what theologians call it. They call them the incommunicable attributes of God, or maybe the sovereign attributes of God would be just as clear, because what these attributes do is they describe and define God's sovereignty. And I'm going to throw it up on the screen just so you know. You've heard these words before. And number one is it's his omniscience. Number two, it's his omnipresence. And number three, it's his omnipotence. And what we're going to discover is through these greatness aspects of God, he bestows on us a goodness. And before I'm done here, I'm going to convince you of that. But let's go read the verse. We're going to start Psalm 139. This will be the omniscience of God as David is describing it as only he can. So listen carefully. O Lord, you have searched me and have known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thoughts afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You have hedged me behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Did you catch all that? He's talking about his omniscience, the fact that God is all-knowing. There is nothing that escapes his notice. He says he knows your thoughts before you think it. He just heard that, by the way. Heard what? The thing you're going to think in just a second. No, he's way ahead of us. It says he knows your words before you speak them. He says he knows your ways before you do them. And David is blown away by this, and he says, this knowledge is too wonderful for me. I can't attain this. This is beyond what I can understand. But understand this, the little bit we can understand is that you cannot hide anything from God. Now, let me ask you a question here. How many of you are fans of Jane Austen, the writer? Any Jane Austen fans in the room? Why are there only women putting up their hand? Where are the men? And Jane Austen actually pioneered a type of writing that was called the third-person omniscient. And here's a couple of her books. You remember this? Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. These are her two most famous. There's many others. And she pioneered this third-person omniscient, where the narrator actually knows the thoughts and the emotions and the feelings of the people that she or he is writing about. And this was one of the things that made her famous and one of the things that made her so unique. Now, I've never read either of these books, just for the record, but I've seen both the movies. You know why I saw the movies? Because I'm a married man. That's why I saw the movies. What was your excuse for seeing them? And here's the reason I'm pointing this out is that is what God is. God is omniscient. He knows every thought, every emotion, every feeling. And not only does he know them, he knows them before they actually happen. And though Jesus may have laid aside some of the divine attributes when he came to earth, we do see moments of this omniscient with Jesus, don't we? It says, and perceiving their thoughts and knowing what they were thinking. You see it all the way through Scripture. Always kind of knew what was going on. It was pretty hard to fool Jesus. Now I have a question for you. Did Jesus know that Judas was going to betray him? Yeah, he did. You read the story. He knew he was going to betray him. Did he know when he chose him? Well, we don't know for sure, but probably. He probably knew when he chose him that this man was going to betray him. He knew he was going to be betrayed. He knew this guy was going to be Judas. And here's the most amazing part of this story for me. He treated him the same as everyone else, knowing he was going to be betrayed and sent to his death by this man. That is an extraordinary kind of humanity. Now, let me just ask you a question. You be honest about this in your heart. If you knew that your friend or your neighbor was going to come into your house someday and kill all your family, would you be treating him with kindness and respect right now? No, we would have a hard time with doing that. We can't do that. But when we look at Jesus, he was able to do that. And he treated Judas every single day with that kind of love and care and concern and respect and dignity right up until the very end, even after the moment he betrayed him. And this is good news for us people, because we have all kinds of thoughts and all kinds of deeds that we're going to do that God knows all about. I want you to just think about this. Why do we think that somehow he's happier with me today than tomorrow when I mess up? The fact is, he doesn't change how he treats you from day to day because his love is unconditional. The Lord is good and his mercy endures forever because he knows what you're going to do. This is fantastic news, people, that God loves you the same every day. And if you're in the midst, this is not permission to behave badly. Please don't take it that way. I'm just saying that he knows you're going to behave badly, but it's out of his greatness. It's out of his omniscience, because he knows the beginning from the end, because he's already at the beginning and the end, that he treats you in such an incredible way. One of my favorite stories, of course, about this is the story of David. And David's biggest blunder, if I was to ask you, what was David's biggest blunder in his life? Yeah, it's not a trick question. It was Bathsheba. I mean, there's other things he did, but Bathsheba stands apart from the rest of them. I mean, what a bonehead move, right? I mean, for the king and the guy who wrote all this great stuff. And there's David, and he's first of all, he's not doing what he should be. He should be out at war. Then he commits adultery, forces himself on this next door neighbor woman who's a married woman. Then he does everything in his power to try to cover it up. Right? He lies and he conspires, and eventually he has her husband Uriah killed. That's a pretty treacherous act for anybody, let alone a king, and let alone a man after God's own heart. And here's the thing that's amazing to me. It seemed like David thought he could cover it up and get away with it. But why did he get caught? Because God knows what he did, and he knew what he was going to do. And I want you to think about this. He knew that he was going to do it before he chose him to be king. And this is important for us to understand. He knew he was going to mess up. He knew he was going to make this mistake. And why do we think for a moment we can hide anything from God? And of course, God just revealed it to the prophet Nathan, and Nathan, called him out on it. And the next thing we know, he's stuck. And the scripture says, and it was actually David who wrote it, and he said, surely your sin will find you out. You can think and imagine that David should have been ruined by that. Would you agree with that? He should have been ruined. He should have lost his life. That would have been the penalty for that. He should have lost his kingdom. All of these things should have happened to him. But he repented. He mourned in sackcloth and ashes. And God not only restored him and left him in a place as king, but God took his mistakes and wove them into his plan. You say, what are you talking about? Well, you remember that David and Bathsheba, because he took the woman and he married her after he killed off the husband, and he had 4 sons with Bathsheba. And the first son's name was Solomon, and he became king. And the third son's name was Nathan. And it's important for this reason, is that Joseph, the supposed father of Jesus, was a direct descendant of Solomon. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a direct descendant of Nathan. And that tells me that God took David's biggest blunder and wove it into his plan. And that's why he says, this is too wonderful for me. How do you even comprehend these things? There is nothing you can hide from God. So the first thing in God's sovereignty is his omniscience. And the second thing is his omnipresence. And omnipresent, we've already talked about this a little bit in this series. It is God's ability to be everywhere at once. That he is not limited to space like we are, and he can be in all places at the same time. And here's what David writes about it when he says this. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning to dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. I think this is an amazing passage that he tells us wherever we are, whatever we're doing, he is there. He is already there. Even if you decide to go to hell, he's still there. I don't know about you, but that's pretty hard for me to even understand. But the fact of the matter is that God is everywhere at once, and we need to begin to understand that. Let me ask you a question. I mean, nobody gets lost these days. You notice that because you got the phone and you got the GPS in it, and you're never lost. It's too bad. You should get lost. But let me ask you this in a real sense. Have any of you ever been like out in the woods or somewhere unfamiliar, and you got truly, truly lost to the point where you were frightened? Anybody have that experience? Yeah, a bunch of people have had that. And I'll tell you something. When you get truly lost, it's a terrible feeling. And I've actually only been really lost once in my life, and it was in the most crowded place in the world, which was kind of bizarre. And I'm going to tell you this story. So it was some years ago. I was in India, and this is what happened. We had finished a mission trip. We were on our way home. We were in the city of Bombay, which is now Mumbai. And we had gone to the hotel, and we quickly checked in. We barely were checked in. And the team leader said this: how many would like to go to the world's largest outdoor market? And at the time, I don't know if it still is, and so we said, yeah, here's a picture of it. It's the world's largest outdoor market. It is streets and streets of this. It's so crowded you can't even move. And how many of you want to go to this, get some souvenirs, take home to your family? So we all thought that sounds like a good adventure. So we checked into the hotel and put our bags in, et cetera. And we got in the taxis, and down we went to this market. I don't even remember what the name of it was. So we get there, and when we got out of the taxi cab, and there was about a dozen of us, he said this. He said, don't get lost, because we'll never find you. And so, I thought, okay, I can do that. So I was there like 10 minutes, and we were walking down and looking at one shop after another, and I was talking away, because that's what I do, and I was talking away and explaining something. Well, look at this, and who'd want to buy this? And I looked, and there was a stranger there. And I thought, where's my bunch? And I looked this way, and I looked that way, and I saw that crowd of people that I just showed you there. And I realized I got separated from them. I thought, well, we were moving this way, so they must have gone that way. So I just kept on moving that way. And after about 15 minutes, I never found them. So I thought maybe they went the other way, or maybe they crossed the street. So I looked and looked, and I'd done this for about an hour. And then all of a sudden, I realized I was lost. And here was the problem. I didn't know where I was, nor did I know where I had come from. My mom always said the stork brought me, but that's not what I'm referring to. I didn't know where my hotel was. And here was the bigger problem. We were leaving that night. We were only in the hotel for a few hours, and we were leaving that night. We had to be at the airport. And I could have, I suppose, taken a cab to the airport, but it wouldn't have done me any good because I didn't have my passport. Because in those days, you had to surrender your passport at the hotel. They had my bags, they had my passport. And there was, I didn't know where I was, and I didn't know where I was actually going. I did not know the name of the hotel, and I didn't know where it was. And I started to absolute panic. I thought, I'm in this sea of people. I don't know where to go. I was standing there. My heart's starting to beat like this. I thought, could I live here? Because that might happen. And I thought, yeah, India's a nice place. I could live here. It would take a while to carve out a life, but I could do it. And I miss my family. And so I'm having this panicking moment. All of a sudden, I started thinking of what David said about where can I flee from your presence. And then I started thinking about what Jesus said. And he says, lo, I am with you even unto the end of the world. I thought, this is the end of the world for me. Not for these people. They live here. But for me, it's the end of the world. And so then I thought, I should just chill because not only does God know where I am, he's there too. So I had this inexplicable peace come over me. And I said, Lord, all right, so you know where I am. You know where I'm going. I need your help. So give me a plan. I just prayed, and I just was at total peace with all these people moving around me, but I still needed an idea. And then I saw these little taxi cabs. They're actually auto rickshaws. It's a motorcycle with a kind of a rickshaw in the back. Some of you have seen those. And I saw this group of about three of them over there. And so I walked over to them, and I said, I wonder if one of you guys can help me. I'm trying to get back to my hotel, but I don't know where it is, and I don't know what it's called. Bombay is a city. Mumbai was a city of 9 million people at the time. I said, I don't know where I'm going. And I said, the only thing I remember was there was a picture of a sun on the sign. And one of the cab drivers said, I know exactly where you're going. Hop in. And I thought, he knows exactly where I'm going. How's this possible? We were at least half an hour away. So I thought, well, I prayed. What do I have to lose? So I jumped into his cab, and I thought, how's he even going to get out of here? There's so many people, you can't even move on the street. And he started up his motor, and he honked his horn, and he drove right into that crowd of people. He drove right into it, and those people jumped out of the way, scattering for their life. And there in that moment, it was like the Red Sea dividing in front of me, and I realized I was having my moment, and I thought, oh yeah, if this guy doesn't kill me, this is going to be a miracle. And he drove me right to my hotel. And then he had the nerve of charging me $2, two Canadian dollars. I thought, wow, God is good. And here's the point, people. You are never lost. God is always with you. When you're in the midst of the deepest and the darkest moment of your life, rest assured that God has not forsaken you. He has not left you out. He has not abandoned you. And he will always be with you wherever you go and whatever you do. It's like this woman, one day she came home and her husband had disappeared. He hadn't come home, and she was really nervous about it. So she went next door and she said to her neighbor, my husband's disappeared. He hasn't been home for like 2 days. And she said, come on, we got to go down to the police department and issue a missing persons report. So they went down, and so the officer said, so what does your husband look like? She said, well, he's tall, dark, handsome, soft-spoken, and kind. And the neighbor looked at her and said, your husband's not like that. He's short, fat, bald, loud, and mean. She says, yeah, I know, but who'd want him back? Don't take that personal, some of you. All right, so the first attribute of God's sovereignty, that he extends his goodness to us, is his omniscience. The second thing is his omnipresence, that he is everywhere. And the last and the final thing is his omnipotence. And his omnipotence is being all-powerful, that he can and will do everything. And not only that, in the true sense of the word omnipotence and sovereignty, he actually controls all things. And see, a lot of times when we think of omnipotence, this is what we think of. We think of dividing the Red Sea and walking on water, and we think of, making the sun stand still, healing lepers, raising the dead. But when you read David's description of it, because David actually is talking about all three of these things, David gives another spin to it that I want to share with you. And so jumping down to verse 13, this is what David says. You have formed my inward parts. You have covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed. And in your book they are all written, the days fashioned for me. When, as of yet, there were none of them, how precious are your thoughts to me, O God. How great is the sum of them. And so when David's describing one of the aspects of God's omnipotence, he's talking about how he's omnipotent towards us, and that he actually is intimately involved, and not only intimately involved, but controlling every aspect of our life. Did you notice he says they're all written in his book, the days fashioned for us? And this is an extraordinary thought to think that God has actually got his hand on you. David says this again and again and again through this psalm, how he leads you and he guides you and he has his hand on you. And now he's talking about the omnipotence in the creation of you and the omnipotence in the life in which you live and the way he guides you. And it creates a couple of paradoxes. And there's many paradoxes, but I'm going to share two of them with you. The first one is this. The first one is the rock paradox. And it goes like this. You've all heard it. Could God make a rock so big he couldn't lift it? Well, if he's God and he can do anything, can he make a rock so big he can't lift it? Now, it's a stupid question, but the answer is actually important. Because what we discover about God is that he is self-limiting. There's nothing he can't do, but there are things he won't do. And he's determined not to do them because they're incongruent with who he is and his character and his plan and his word. So, for example, Hebrews says that God cannot lie. He cannot lie. It's not going to happen. So that's something he can't do, but he is determined. He's not going to, because to lie would be inconsistent with who he is. God in a way is kind of predictable. I don't want to call him overly predictable, but he's consistent. This guy came up to me and said, God spoke to me and told me to leave my wife and marry my secretary. You know what I said? No, he didn't. And he said, how would you know what God said to me? And I said, because God wouldn't say something to you that was inconsistent with his word and with his character. So I know 100% unequivocally that he did not tell you that. And see, this helps us because what we do is when we read his word and we begin to discover his nature and his character, then we can begin to determine what he's trying to do with our life. Now, it brings us to the second paradox, which is the free will paradox. And people really struggle with this. They don't understand. They say, well, if God is sovereign, and if God is truly has my days numbered, and if God is truly controlling my life, and is God truly leading me every step of the way, because a man plans his way in his heart, but the Lord directs his steps. So if God's directing my steps through life, then I have no free will. And these two different poles are mutually exclusive. They are in contradiction with one another. And these people argue about it all the time because they don't realize that God in his omnipotence can actually take these two poles and put them in a dynamic tension and cause them to work together. You say, well, how does that work, Pastor Mark? Well, how would I know how it works? It's a mystery, man, but it's true. And I think the guy who said it better than anybody else was Matthew Henry. And Matthew Henry wrote that. He was a theologian, wrote a great commentary on the Bible. And this is how he says it. He says, when you get to heaven, there's going to be a big sign over the gates of heaven, and it's going to say, whosoever will. And you're going to walk through those gates, those pearly gates, and you're going to turn around, and on the back side of the gates it says, chosen from the foundation of the earth. And you see, God somehow, because he is sovereign, because he is omnipotent, he can weave your free will along with his divine plan for your life. And see, should give us great comfort that even when you make bonehead mistakes, which you will, which you already have, and you're going to make some more, even like David did, you begin to recognize God's going to weave it all together. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I struggle the most with, because he says he's fashioned your days. And so why is it that people die prematurely? And as a pastors, we end up having to do funerals for people who have died prematurely. We have to do funerals for children and funerals for young people. And I'm telling you, it's the hardest thing to make sense of. And I'll say, I know what you're thinking right now. See, I'm omniscient sometimes too, right? And I said, no, I know what you're thinking right now. And the big question is always this, why? Why, Lord? Why, Lord? They're all thinking that. And I always tell them this. I said, don't ask the question why. There's two reasons why you don't want to ask that question. Number one, you probably won't get an answer. Number two, even if you did get an answer, you're probably not going to like it. So you're better off not asking it. And instead, ask a better question. And the better question is, why did we have the opportunity to know that person and the difference and the benefit of our life? That's the question people need to talk about. What did I get out of this? How are we richer, better people? Because at least for those years, we knew that person. So I want to tell you a little story. I'm going to close with this, kind of weave all these things together I've talked about. So some of you know my good friend, Bruce Martin. Bruce Martin pastored Calvary Temple in the city here for 25 years. He retired. But let me, in all sincerity, say he's actually one of the finest people I've ever known in my life and probably one of the best pastors I've ever met. And so now he's got a little more time in his hands because he's retired. And this week he got a call from a funeral director. He knows more funeral directors than anybody because he's done more funerals than anybody on the planet Earth or history. And so the funeral director phones him up and says, I'm doing this funeral and we're short a pallbearer. Would you come? I don't need you to do the service because we're not doing a service, but I need a pallbearer. So he says, sure, I'll do that. And so he goes down there, and when he gets there, he finds out that it's a 29-year-old woman that died, terrible circumstances, and had died. But here's what made it worse, that she was an unclaimed body. She wasn't anonymous. They knew who she was. They had her, credentials and her name and knew who she was. But nobody came to claim her. No family, no friends, no associates. And there she was. She died alone and was now alone. And there was a group home that heard about this, and they didn't know this woman, but they heard about it. And they showed up at the funeral home, and they said, if nobody's going to claim her, we're going to claim her. And we're going to mourn her loss. And so these 8 women, they showed up at the funeral home, and they said, we don't want a religious service. We just want to talk amongst ourselves, and we'll take her out to the graveside, and we'll just put her in the ground, and we'll be done with it. So then there Bruce was. He was told what his job was. His job was to carry the casket with the other 5 that had volunteered to do this. And so they went out to the graveside, and he was about to do his part, and one of the women recognized him because he's head and shoulders above most people, and so she recognized him and said, that's the pastor from Calvary Temple. And they talked amongst themselves and said to the funeral director, why don't you get him to say a few words? Would you do that? But nothing too religious. So the funeral director takes Bruce's spot on the casket, and Bruce goes in front. He has no prayer book. He has no Bible on him. He hasn't prepared, doesn't know these women, doesn't know this woman who died. But he has this moment where he has to do something about it. So he walks up to the grave. They bring the casket, and they place the casket there, and he looks at this group of 8 women, and this is what comes out of his mouth. He says, what's happening here right now says a lot about you 8 women. That you would have it in your heart to not let someone die alone and by themselves and leave this world, but that you cared enough about another human being that you did not know that you would show up and mourn her death. That says a lot about you. By this time, he's got them all in tears. And then he says, would you mind if I prayed? They all nodded. And so then he starts to pray. He starts to preach the gospel. and he says the committal prayer, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, and she goes into the grave. And he told me this story, and I was blown away by it, and I'll tell you why. Because here was this woman, probably through a combination of some really bad choices and some really terrible circumstances, ends up losing her life at 29 years old with no family and no friends. But our God in heaven did not leave her and did not forsake her. And he sent 12 mourners to mourn her death and the most distinguished pastor in our entire city to give a service for her. That's the God that I serve, and that's why I say, oh, good Lord.
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.